Um, as I was driving in today, I was listening to Galei Tzahal, and they broadcast a song written in memory of Yam Glass. Yam was one of the officers of the Tatzpitaniyot who was murdered on October 7th. And I thought how appropriate that I think of her, that I remember her, that I listened to a song that was written in her memory and sung by her boyfriend, as we go into a series of Midrashim on the use of the female in Eichah Rabbah, and what the character, the demut of women in these Midrashim represents. And of course, when we look back and tell our stories of October 7th, the women, the piece of the women who were fighters and who were heroic, the women who were victims, unfortunately, to terrible assault. There's something very poignant in the use or the memory or the figure of women that touches us in a different place. And Chazal are not oblivious to that. And we're going to see that initially in the Midrashim, there's going to be a very harsh use of the female character that's going to soften as we go through some of these texts. What I want to start off with, this really is, I would say, I know Shvasar B'Tammuz was not, we're kind of like getting towards the end of what we'll call the 3-week period, moving towards the 9 days, which starts on Shabbat. This shir really brings up a lot of the questions we ask at this time of year around theodicy, around the idea of innocent people being harmed, being killed, suffering, and where is God in these moments? And it's a question that has recurred throughout history. And so we're going to open up with a text that really has nothing to do with Eichah Rabbah, has nothing to do with the destruction per se, although we're going to see it actually does. It's a midrash that appears in Vayikra Rabbah 25, and it's a midrash in the aftermath of the death of Nadav and Avihu. And it's one of those midrashim that essentially does not blame Nadav and Avihu, it blames God. And that opportunity or the space that opens up when we allow ourselves to be angry at God. And I gave a class 2 weeks ago for Pardes, a week and a half ago, and on Chana. And in the audience, it was on Zoom, in the Zoom audience, was a woman whose son was killed in a terror incident. And I talked about anger, and that Chana basically says to God, you are not being fair to me. This is unfair. I'm angry at you, God. You're God. You couldn't give me a child? Like, what is wrong with you? And she afterwards thanked me, and she said, I've been so angry. I've been so angry all these years. And I feel like often people try to comfort me, and let's find meaning, and let's find atonement, and don't question God. And she's like, here you have a midrashic text that not just questions God, but says to God, how dare you? You're God. And so we're going to see something similar as we open up, which I think is a legitimate voice, particularly at this time of year, particularly at this time in history, where, thank God, we're sitting in our country for the first time in thousands of years, and we have an army that defends us. And yet, we are also sitting on the ground in mourning. So much tragedy and so much loss at this time. And it begs the question, why? Why again are we in a situation where everyone hates us, where all they see is the criminal acts we are purported to do? And what about our vicious enemies? And how is no one calling out about the evil? And why? So let's take a look. Rabach Rav Zera Patach, Af lezot yecharad libi v'yitar mimkomo. In the way the Midrash does, it opens up, there are plenty of source sheets if anyone needs. It opens up with a pasuk from Eov. Often the Midrash starts in a place very far from the text that it is interpreting, and then it brings, the far text closer to the text that is open for interpretation. And it's a verse from Eov. At this also my heart trembles, vayitar, out of its place. And the Gemara then says, Ma'u vayitar? Yikpots. Kach dvarim amru, l'nater bahen al haaretz. Wherewith to leap upon the earth. So let's take a look at how we're going to pull this together. In Vayikra Yud Aleph, we're talking about animals that leap. And so they say the word Vayitar, what does it mean that your heart trembles, Vayitar, out of its place? Well, I know that Vayitar means to jump, because I have a description of an animal in Yud Aleph that jumps. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Lo yiyu banav shel Aaron domim l'mateu, shenichnas yavesh v'yatza lach, Titus harasha nichnas lebeit kodshei kodashim v'charvo shlufo biyado gider et haparochet v'yatzat charvo meleah dam. Nichnas b'shalom v'yatza b'shalom. And so here it comes. God says to God's self, that's what's powerful about this text. God says, shall the sons of Aaron not be like his staff, which went in dry and came out bursting with the almond flowers, came out alive and wet, so to speak, full of sap? The wicked Titus enters the interior of my Kodesh Kodashim, and he uses his sword and cuts into the curtain, and all this blood pours out after, because of course he's murdering all the Kohanim. And he enters in peace, and he exits in peace. And so it's God speaking to God's self. I allowed Titus to go in and wreak destruction and terrible suffering and oppression and murder, and you're not supposed to be able to go into the Kodesh Kodashim unlawfully, and I allowed Titus to emerge unscathed, and the sons of Aaron, what did they do, Sachakol? And they went in to offer incense, and they came out as a burnt offering. So the Midrash has God asking that question, right? Not us, because it would be heretical perhaps for us to ask. But they allow God to ask the question about theodicy, God to reflect on what seems patently unfair in the way the world is run. And there the text ends, Uvanav shel Aaron nichnasu la'akriv yatzu srufim, right? They went in to offer, and they came out as a burnt offering. Acharei mot shnei bnei Aaron. And here the idea is, my heart trembles and jumps out of its place when I consider this kind of unfairness, right? Sadiq v'rala. When I consider ra v'tovlo, that's my heart leaps, it trembles, it has no peace. Okay, let's take a look at the next source. Now we're moving into Eichah Rabbah. So that was really just an introduction, a painful one, but one in which the Midrash is not afraid of opening space where we don't just say it's all for the best. There are moments we do, right? The Rav Nachman of Breslov mantra, which is Kol Tova, right? Everything is for the best. Everything God does is for the best. In this Midrash, the Midrash says, no, it's not. And God wonders, is it all for the best? And now we're moving into Eichah Rabbah, the Proem, the Petichta, and we're going to continue. Right? There's a clear linkage between the Midrash I just brought and the next Midrash. Eichah Rabbah is not that late. It's actually one of the earlier Midrashim of the Rabbahs. Yeah, it's probably between 6 and 800. The Tanchumas are much later, but this is not such a late Rabbah. No, this Midrash is not so late. I think it's actually between 4 and 600. It's actually earlier than some of the others. So we have a pasuk from Yirmiyahu, very appropriate. Adonai tzvaot hitbonenu v'kar'u lemakonanot v'tavo'ena. So this idea of call for the mourning women. Now we're already moving towards the theme of this class, which is the role of women. We know in Eichah, women are very prominent. The idea of Yerushalayim as an Ishan not nida, right? A menstruant woman, an abandoned woman, something very poignant and pathetic about a woman who is abandoned, who is sitting in her filth, right? That's the idea, the metaphor, that there's something about an unbathed, unclean woman that is very degrading, very humiliating, very jarring. And so in Yirmiyahu, we have a different image. The image is call for the mourning women. And if you've learned to boat with me, you know that there was a profession of mourning women. You would call for the mourning women, and that a woman was entitled at her death to mekonenot, to women who would come in keen, who would wail for her. That her husband had to hire musicians, right? A chalil, someone who would play a flute of some sort, and you'd have to have wailing women, and that was her right in marriage. So it's a profession of women by women for men and women, right? We're not worrying about Kol Isha here. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish and the rabbis comment as follows. I'm going to switch to the English. Actually, I want to read the Mashal. We'll do some more in English to save time, but right now we'll do the Hebrew. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Lamelech Shayu Lo Shnei Banim. We have a king with 2 sons. Ka'as al Rishon Natal et hamakel v'chavto v'higlehu. So God gets angry at the first. He picks up his staff. The king is always God. It is God, but okay, we're not there yet. The king has 2 sons. He gets angry at the first. He picks up his rod. He thrashes his first son, and he exiles him. Amar oy lezeh me'ezeh Shalvan Nigla. And he says, woe to him, for all comfort has he been banished. He feels bad, but what can you do? That is the role of father and king. He does the same thing to the second son. He doesn't seem to be able to educate his sons to go in the way that he wants them to go. He thrashes and exiles the second son, and then he says, Anahu de tarbuti bisha. He says, well, it was me. I've obviously failed. Right? With the second son, he recognizes the pattern. With the first son, he blames the son. Woe to the son. With the second son, the king blames himself. And then what does he say? Kach galu aseret hashvatim v'yitchel HaKadosh Baruch Hu omer lahem et hapasuk hazeh oy lahem ki nadadu mimeni, right from Hosea. Woe to them, for they have strayed from me. And when kevan shegalu Yehuda v'Inyamin kaviyachol amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu oy li al shvari. God already begins to look inward and doesn't have compassion for the son, but looks at himself. The Midrash is not perfect, right? In the Mashal, the king blames himself, kiviyachol, right? We can't go as far as to say God blames God's self, but they bring a pasuk in Yirmiyahu, oy li. I'm no longer thinking about my son, I'm thinking about myself. The second part of the Midrash is much more drastic, it's very, very jarring. Reish Lakish says, the Melech hayulo shnei banim, ka'as al rishon v'natal et hamakel v'chavto v'pirper v'meit. Reish Lakish says, no, we're not talking about a thrashing that leads to exile. We're talking about the king beats his son until he's parper v'meit. He fibrillates. And then he dies. And then hitchil mekonen alav. He still has the ability to mourn, to wail over him. When it gets to the second, Natalat hamakel v'chavto v'parper v'meit, amar me'ata ein bi koach lekonen alehem, ela kar'u lemekonenot v'tekonenu alehem. In the second child, he beats the child dies. He says, call for the mourning women. I don't have any ability to mourn anymore. I'm all cried out, so to speak. And so the Nimshal is the 10 tribes and then Yehuda and Binyamin. And so scholars have noted, right, the idea of calling for the mourning women, that in the Nimshal, God says, God who is very masculine in this Midrash, right, the God of this Midrash is a violent God, is a very violent, angry king, a very masculine image. Violence, that's the response to misbehavior, that's the response to defiance, the beating, the thrashing, the first exile and in the second part death. And the idea of the mourning women, calling for the mourning women, as if God, who is so masculine, suddenly says, I need something feminine, I can't cry. I need to open up a space in which there are tears and there is wailing and there is mourning, but I don't have the strength to do that. So we see, I don't have the strength, the wherewithal, the tools, fill it in as you will, and we see something, the use of the Midrash here, that the masculine versus the feminine, the idea that sometimes all of those qualities of strength and power and violence, which are necessary, the king will say it's necessary when there's defiance and disobedience. And yet, there also has to be space in the aftermath for mourning over the loss and over the destruction. So that really is, in the aftermath of the first Midrash, this sense of the helplessness, the powerlessness of the king in the aftermath. What did I do? Why did I do that? How do I now express my complex emotions if I was the one who ordered this action, or if I carried out this action? Do I have the right to mourn, to cry, to feel pain? Call the mourning women. Let's take a look at, we're now in Eichah Rabbah Parsha Aleph. Sorry, we'll end on a hopeful, something that'll bring us, I hope, some comfort. So I'm already saying we're going into this because this is where we are at this time of year, and this is where we should be directing our thoughts. Eichah Rabbah. We're now going to look at a series of stories in Eichah Rabbah. It's a very, very long chapter. I will say it's a wonderful chapter. It's a chapter in which, when you read Eichah is just one long cry of pain. Right? A little bit at the end, you begin to pull out of it. Hashiveni Hashem Elecha v'nashuva, we will return to you. And the last chapter has little seeds of hope that we will return, that we will be redeemed. But for the most part, it is the aftermath to such destruction that nothing in Eichah answers the question, why did this happen? It's just terrible descriptions of the young virgins and the young men and the babies who are swooning and the old people, right? It's terrible, it's brutal, it's so painful, and we sit on the floor and read it. Eichah Rabbah, which is hundreds of years after the destruction of Bayit Sheni, let alone Bayit Rishon, allows the space for, why did this happen to us? Let's begin to look at where society was. Now, it's not a historical retelling, right? We're talking about hundreds of years later. Some of the stories have been passed down, but the rabbis at this point are interested in, first of all, some of the questions about God that are already coming up, and some of the questions about our own behavior. What led to this that maybe we can learn from it? And we're going to see some of that reflected in the text today. One of the things I like to point out, I've been very into storytelling this year and how we tell our stories, and stories that repeat and stories that, the variation on stories, and we see it even in the Torah, right? We have two versions of creation. If you look carefully, there are two versions of the Noach story embedded within one another. We have two versions of Yitro, right, in Shmot and in Dvarim, two versions of the spies, Bamidbar and Dvarim. The idea that when stories get retold, details are changed. If you even think about how you tell your own stories to your children, to your grandchildren, what we edit out, what we overly dramatize or emphasize to give effect, exaggerate sometimes. Right? And when I think about the difference between the Shoah and October 7th, it's very, very clear we are in a very different space. The Shoah, it takes decades and decades and decades until the survivors begin to tell their story. And if you go back and even read some of the stories that are written in the aftermath of the Holocaust, they're not just, they're terrible, but they're not curated in any way. There's like a sense of rawness. I've read some of those testimonies right after, the ones who wrote down their stories right after it happened. No one wants to read them, by the way. They don't really have a broad readership. They kind of get buried. One of the ones I think of is Giselle Pearl, who was a doctor, who was a OBGYN in the camps and then moved to America, almost prosecuted for war crimes because she was conducting abortions in Auschwitz to save women. But it's a very difficult story to read. And what happens later is people have a little bit of distance. They're telling their stories, but it's been a little more processed, polished, developed, right? It's still a brutal story, but it's being told in a different way with the distance of decades. It takes so long for Holocaust survivors to tell their stories. Only the grandchildren, right? Many people have the experience that only when the grandchildren come to ask what happened, people will say, my mother told her story, not my father. October 7th, we begin telling the stories the next day, right? The ability, the wherewithal, the need to tell that story is very, very, it's immediate. Again, we can talk about why. Social media, the idea that I need to process my trauma, and telling the story is one way. Survivors wanted to survive. They wanted to revive and rebuild. They didn't want to deal with trauma and loss. And by the way, no one was ready to hear their stories. The world, Israel, think about what happened to survivors who came here. The Sabonim, to use a very crude term, that the Israelis called them, right? No one was ready to hear the stories of the survivors. And on October 8th, we were already ready to hear, right? Things change. Eichah, why am I saying this? Because with Eichah, it takes hundreds of years until they're really ready to go back and look at some of the stories and begin processing some of the stories. And with the distance, the rabbis who are of the Midrash, the rabbinic generation, is beginning to say, okay, we need to pull out, and with distance, we begin to try to understand why this happened. Okay? Amru alav al Doeg ben Yosef Shemei. So we have someone named Doeg ben Yosef. There's a pasuk. I didn't bring it in the Hebrew, and I'm sorry, I don't know it by heart. But see, O Lord, and consider to whom you have done this. Shall the women eat their fruit, the children that are dandled in the hands, and so on. That's a pasuk from Yirmiyahu. This is an Eichah Rabbah. And they say about Doeg ben Yosef, who died. Now, the name Doeg is a very loaded name. We don't have a lot of good people named Doeg Ha'adomi in Shmuel, who's responsible for the downfall of Nov. And he dies. So this is Doeg ben Yosef. He dies, and he leaves Hiniach ben Katan le'imo. Now, I'm already going to tell you this is a shocking, shocking midrash. And it's shocking because it's not what we think about motherhood. It's not what we like to think about women who are heroic in saving their children. Again, if I go to Holocaust, We like the stories about women who went with their children to their death and protected their children. It turns out there are mothers who did not, who chose themselves over their children. Those are not the stories we like to tell and remember, because we have a narrative that mothers are supposed to do everything for their children, and many women do. Not all women. And this Midrash shocks us because it brings a mother who chooses her own survival and sacrifices her child to survive. And it's a shocking symbol of a kind of selfishness, of a brutality, a survival of the fittest, that while if we hear it about men, we might say, oh yeah, right, that's very masculine. We might. But women don't behave that way. And the Midrash deliberately uses a mother. Right? We're meant to be shocked. What is going on at the time? This is Bayit Rishon. This would be Bayit Rishon. What's going on? So what happens? Well, it's actually Bayit Sheni, but some of the characters here, it's anachronistic, right? It's using both Bayit Rishon and Bayit Sheni. And what would she do? What does she do? She would measure him in tfachayim. Like she would, tefach is a hand's breadth, and she would measure her child. It's so beautiful. She would literally how many hand's breadths are you, sweetheart? And then, where you make a little mark on the wall and it's been 10 hand's breadths. But you feel the lovingness of her measuring her child with her hands. V'notenet mishkala zahav b'chol shana v'shana l'shamayim. And she gives that amount in gold. Well, that amount of 10 hand's breadths is 10 sela of gold, whatever it is. But you have this sense of her love for her child translating into her love for God. Right? That idea that she then takes all this gold and brings it to the temple. And we have a widow and we have an orphan. And we're meant to be kind to the widows and orphans. And they're vulnerable in our society. And this seems to be a wealthy widow. And so every year she goes and she donates. And wow, we're enamored with her. What does she do? She slaughters her child. I believe this is an exaggeration. There's no proof that this actually happens. Right? The Eichah alludes to it, but she slaughters her child with her hands and then eats him. Right? I'm sorry, it's quite grotesque. But the hands that lovingly measured become the hands that slaughtered. Now we're going to see in a minute where the Midrash is going. It's not just bringing us a grotesque description. Va'aleha mikonein Yirmiyahu ve'omar im tochalna nashim piryam olelei tipuchim. Right, this is the pasuk in Eichah, famous pasuk. If women will eat their children, that they dandled in their hands, the fruit of their hands. And v'ruach hakodesh tzavachta ve'omeret im yareg b'mikdash Adonai kohen v'navi. That there's a pasuk in Eichah as well. God cries out, or the Holy Spirit, and says, if will be killed in my temple, the temple of the Lord, a Kohen and Navi, and the Midrash tells us Zechariah ben Yehoiada was a Kohen who was killed by the people for protesting their immoral behavior. And so this is the temple. What is the message here? A temple in which gold is being dropped down on buckets and bags of gold by women like this. It's a rotten temple. It looks nice, has all this gold. So beautiful, so pretty. But really at its core, it's rotten, because if you have a woman who can measure out the gold for the temple and then slaughter her child, that's what's wrong with this generation. That's the reason God destroys the temple. Okay, so it uses this symbol, or the metaphor of the mother who slaughters her child to say, guys, this was your temple. These were the priests you were bringing all those bags of gold to, all you people. Who's responsible for that? It's not God. You as a society became immoral and corrupt. You as a society allowed this kind of behavior, and it led to an exposure, right? What happens, they say, the minute things get tough, the destruction begins. There's not just survival of the fittest, what is that word, where the society just completely, all the niceties of society disappear because there's no moral anchor, there's no core, just everything collapses. Let's take a look at the next few sources about the Miriam series, I call them. In these stories, all the women are named Miriam, right? It was Mary. It's a very popular name. There's the Mary stories, that Mary of Magdalene, Mary of She's his mother, Mary. There are two Marys in that story. Mary is one of the most common names. Miriam, Mary, right? And so all of these stories are Miriam stories. It's not surprising. It could be they were all named Miriam. It makes sense. It's a very popular name. Maaseh b'Marta bat Baitus, right? She's Miriam in Hebrew, Marta in the Greek. Shekadsha Yoshua ben Gamla. So here we have a story. Miriam, the daughter of Baitus. The Baitusim, right? We've heard of them. They tend to get into conflict with the Prushim, right? They're very, very fanatic about biblical text or how they interpret the law. And also Baitus was very, very wealthy, which is why he could kind of oversee a whole group of people who follow him. And she marries Yoshua ben Gamla, and here's the catch. Again, we're talking about criticism of the temple. Umineo hamelech lio kohen gadol. Now, Yoshua ben Gamla sometimes is really a tzaddik, and sometimes he is not. In this story, he was appointed to be Kohen Gadol, even though he's not a Kohen. So we already begin to understand you can buy the priesthood. You can buy the high priesthood if you want to, right? Very powerful position. And so the king appoints Yoshua ben Gamla, who happens to be married to Marta bat Baitus, Miriam bat Baitus, who happens to be the daughter of a very wealthy, very powerful man. Power begets power. Power seeks power. V'kintzan, he marries her. She says, you know what, I want to go hear my husband once upon a time. She's like, you know what, I really feel like hearing him read the Torah on Yom Kippur. He's supposed to read the passages about the high priest on Yom Kippur that are in Vayikra. Ma'asula, what did they have to do? Hotziula tapetot. They had to get all these rugs. It's Yom Kippur. She's making all of her servants work on Yom Kippur to bring her to the temple. And they have to take out the tapetot, the carpets. Mi petach beitad, petach beit hamikdash. Again, these stories are wonderful, and whether they're exaggerated or not, this one's actually quite believable. She's a very spoiled, pampered woman. That's the woman in this picture. Again, we already have a mother who is willing to sacrifice her child for her own survival. Now we have wealthy, pampered women, a little in the Marie Antoinette model, right? That idea that these women are totally devoid of any sort of awareness of what's happening in society. And she wants to go on Yom Kippur, right? She wants to hear her husband read, which you're like, oh, that's a nice thing to do. But then you begin to think about it. No! All these people are schlepping the carpets so that your feet don't have to touch the ground. Kedei shelo yachfu ragleha. So her feet shouldn't touch the ground. They shouldn't become damp. They shouldn't, lo aleinu, touch the hard floor. She's like the princess and the pea, right? She even through the carpet, she feels the dirty, dark, cold ground. And it's not enough, these carpets, right? She needs more. And so what happens? Kshemet Yoshua ba'ala paskula chachabim satayin yayin beveitin. V'lo tanina she'en poskin yayin liisha b'beitin. So here they go off on a little bit of a side tangent, which if you learn Ketubot is great. But they give her an enormous amount, 2 sa'ah of wine a day. It's like a barrel of wine a day for a woman, right? And she's not married, which already brings up questions. And then there's a question, but we don't normally allow wine to a woman who's not married. And then they say, no, I'm going to skip down. They make allowances for cooking purposes, not to drink, if you're nursing a child, and so on. And then look at Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok. May I not live to behold the consolation of Zion if I did not see the Romans bind her hair to the tail of the horses of Arabs and make her run from Yerushalayim to Lud. Terrible, terrible description. And he quotes Dvarim. Again, this is not the time to start talking about when a verse works very well with the statement of a sage, of a Tana. But look at the verse. Harkaba v'ha'anuga asher lo nista kaf ragla hatzeg al haaretz mitaneg umaruch. And the pasuk in Dvarim, which is the tochacha, the tender and delicate women among you who would not adventure to set the sole of her feet upon the ground for delicateness and tenderness. And so we have that woman not able to even walk on carpets from her home to the Beit Mikdash, and the Tochacha describes that, right? These tender, delicate women, and the Midrash becomes cynical about it, right? Like in a cynical way. It's not just a tragedy. It's like, who are these pampered, spoiled women? The wife of the Kohen Gadol. This is our model. And then Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok says something very shocking. He says, I'll be comforted, right? May I not live Ereb Nechama im lo ra'iti, that the whole initiative the whole framework not just crumbles, is crushed, is bashed, is destroyed. And of course, the binding her hair to the tails of horses appears in a famous story that we learned in NCSY that becomes a story about what does she do, Margie, when she's being tied? What does she ask for? Do you remember? A pin to tie together her skirt. Those of us who grew up in good Orthodox day school education are told about this valiant young girl who all she can think about is that her legs not be exposed while the horses are dragging her and so on. So I believe that story borrows the image from here. And then again, what do we do with the story? We want the message to reflect whatever message we're given, and we tell young women that this is what you should sacrifice for your tzniut, and this is what this young woman did, and so on. But it comes from Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Tzadok. Is it possible the Romans did this? Of course it's possible. The Romans were absolutely brutal and cruel when it came to inflicting punishment. And Rabbi Elazar may be describing something he saw. But he basically says, I don't believe he's happy to see women suffering in this way, but he's saying if we get that low, if we're brought that low, if we're crushed that far, then maybe we have a chance of rebuilding. Maybe we have a chance of doing it right the next time. So we have another example of a spoiled, pampered woman. We're going to see it again in a moment with Miriam, the daughter of Nakdimon, another very wealthy, powerful man. And what does he do? They gave her 500 gold dinars to be spent on her store of perfumes daily, right? Like an astonishing amount from her husband's estate. This would be coming from her husband's estate. Nevertheless, she cursed them and said, make such a paltry allowance for your own daughters. To which they all said, Amen. Yes, we wish we could give our daughters 500 gold dinars a day. Remember, the time of Bayit Sheni, there's famine, there's hunger, there's terrible, terrible poverty. And all she's worried about is 500 gold dinars daily for her perfume, right? The idea is the disconnect between this woman's world and everything else going on is just enormous. And we like the stories about Florence Nightingale and Clara Barton, and Henrietta Zoltz, the ones who go out and see the poverty and start ministering, Mother Teresa, right? Those are the stories that we think, oh yes, that's very female, that's very womanly. And the Midrash says, no, I'm not letting you go there. Because there are also this model of women. And this is what's happening at the end of Bayit Sheni. And it's not God. It's your society that is allowing these women to behave in this way that shows an absolute moral degradation of society. I'll just pause to say, Tikva Freimer-Kensky looks at Shoftim, and she says, the violence towards women in society is an expression of where society is morally. The Midrash is saying the behavior of these kind of women in society is a reflection of how rotten and corrupt the women are. That's what they're trying to say. Let's look at the women. Let's see how the women are behaving. Yeah, they're going to look at the men also, don't worry. But what's shocking here is how prevalent the image of women is. We don't have a lot of Midrashim that have such a continuum of stories about women of this nature. There's definitely something they're trying to say here about what society looks like when you have women who are capable of unbelievable tzniut and chesed and tov, right? We know that women can do that. And yet here they are, right, asking for their 500 gold dinar at a time of poverty and famine. And here Rabbi Elazar says as well, may I not live to behold the consolation of Zion if I do not see her gathering barley from beneath horses' hoofs in Akko. And I quoted this verse, and again it's a verse from Shir HaShirim, doesn't matter. And another example, and it was in Daf Yomi, I think it's I mix up where it is in the Gemara, I know where it is in the Midrash, where she keeps sending her servant out first to get her fine flour, and he comes back and he's like, they're out of fine flour, and then she's like, okay, get me the next good thing. And each time she sends him out, by the time he gets there, it's gone. And so it's the same woman, it's Miriam bat Nakdimon, and she ends up having to eat like a fig that like is like disgusting and mutilated, and when she sucks out the inside of the fig, she dies because the food is it's so disgusting to her and so on. So it's the same idea that she now, in order to feed herself, has to pick barley from the dung of the animals. That's how low she's been brought. What I want to look at next, I'm shifting. Now we're moving to something. This next story, which appears, the Miriam stories are in order. The Doeg story actually belongs after the Miriam story, but I started with it because it's such a shocking story and I felt it was a good entry into the series. The next story about Miriam bat Tanchum, to me, is the turning point, because after that, the Miriam after is going to look very different. Tanchum is a baker, so the next two stories are going to be about Miriam bat Tanchum. Two different Miriam bat Tanchums, perhaps. It's hard to believe they're the same Miriam. So she's taken captive and ransomed in Akko. There's a story of a captivity. And the people who ransom her buy her a garment, chaluk echad. They buy her one garment to clothe herself, which suggests, right, she's in this market and she's unclothed, at the height of indignity. And when she goes to wash it, because every so, right, v'yarda litvol bayam, which has a double meaning. She goes to wash herself, right, litvol, to try to purify herself, maybe. That's certainly the connotation. And she is washing her chaluk. She has only one chaluk. Sometimes you have to wash it. Va'ala hayam vehetzif et keleha. And the sea rose up and grabbed her garment, took her garment. So it's taken off to sea, and now she's unclothed again. So what happens? Hiviu la'acher. They bring her another one. They don't bring her two, they bring her one. Same thing happens. So again, with the image of this woman who was taken into captivity, she was a hostage, she had to be redeemed. She's now utterly naked, right, in every way. And she's given a garment, and she goes down to wash the garment and litvol, and to purify. And the sea keeps taking away her garment. But this is where it's interesting. Kevan shira'ata kach amra, hanichu legabai legavot et chovo. Allow the collector to collect his debt. What she says in that moment is, I can't just be the victim and you keep replacing the garment. I have to recognize there's a message here. God is sending me a message. I'm immersing as if just a dip in the water is going to purify. But I actually have to do tshuva. I actually have to take responsibility and accountability for what led to this moment, right? For the state that I'm in. Again, it's a message that Chazal are giving. It's very easy to sit on the ground on Eichah and just tear our clothes and cry and mourn and be the victims of a terrible, terrible tragedy, which it was. But the message here is, until you pause and say, wait a minute, I have to try to understand why this happened and what God is sending, what the debt is that is being collected, we're never going to be able to emerge on the other side in any sort of coherent, purified way. And so the woman, right, so it's the image of the woman who brings us this message, the degraded, captive, naked woman who actually in her nakedness says, wait, don't bring me another garment until I'm worthy of being clothed. I have to figure out what my part in this is. I think it's a very powerful message. And then what happens? Then that garment is brought back, right? Like God sends a hint to the sea. So another example, deliberately, of a woman, right? This very pathetic, vulnerable image of the woman who we think, no, she's not responsible at all. She shouldn't be responsible. She was taken captive. She was, the sea keeps taking her garment. It's not her fault. And she has the wherewithal to suddenly say, wait, stop. Again, in her nakedness, do not clothe me until I am worthy of being clothed, until I actually do something active. And we know that a lot of trends in therapy, it's not about blame, but it's about accepting responsibility. There's something in, yes, terrible things have happened. And you have to find the strength to move forward, not just lean back. Next story. It's a very famous story. It's going to be the Chana and the Seven Sons story. She's not called Chana. She's called Miriam. Chana is Yosifun in the 10th or 10th century, I believe, who rewrites the story and calls her Anne. Anne or Chana was a very popular Greek name. Well, Anne would have been a popular name in the Greco-Roman world. Chana is the Hebrew version of Anne. For those who are both Anne and Chana, right? There's a connection there. And in the earliest version, the earliest version actually appears in Maccabim, Sefer Maccabim. This is the next version in Eichah Rabbah, where she's called Miriam. In Maccabim, I think she's also called Miriam, and later she will be called Chana. This is actually the Maccabim story. It's in the second book of Maccabees. Is just it's so grotesque that you're limbs get chopped up, blood is spurting. It's just very, very grotesque. You can imagine from a storytelling perspective, it would be very grabbing, right? You're going to remember it. I brought you a slightly, they cleaned up some of the grotesqueness. There was an incident involving Miriam, daughter of the baker, the Tanchum, who was taken captive with her 7 sons. So maybe it is the same Miriam, maybe it's a different Miriam, but she's taken captive and she has her 7 sons. Again, if I were actually reading them, maybe the story we just read is after this story, but it's the order is the order I'm reading it in. The emperor took them and placed them behind 7 partitions. He brought the first and said, prostrate yourself to the idol. He said to him, God forbid, I will not. Why not? Because it is written in the Torah, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, I am the Lord your God. He took him out and executed him. So I'll say in Maccabees they describe in detail what each execution looked like. Again, I don't recommend it, but I am saying there is something like so over the top that at a certain point you're like, this is ridiculous. Okay. He took out the second and said to him, prostrate yourself to the idol. He said to him, God forbid my brother did not prostrate himself, and I will not bow as well. He says, why? Because it is written in the Torah, you shall have no other gods before me. This goes a second time. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is that each time the son is brought out, he quotes a different pasuk, right? Each of these sons know their scripture very, very well. He takes out the third and the fourth and the fifth. Through the Midrash, it's a wonderful way of learning psukim. Right? The psukim are reminding us over and over about fidelity to one God, over and over, and who God is. And now let's skip down to the 7th. He took out the 7th, who was the youngest of them all. He said, my son, bow to the idol. He said, God forbid. He said, why? It's written in the Torah. And again, this young child also knows a pasuk in Dvarim. There is no repeat of the psukim. It tells us how many times God reminds us that there is only one God. I am the Lord your God. And so on. He quotes Dvarim, and then he quotes another pasuk in Dvarim. Turn to page 5. Okay. And the emperor said to him, again, another pasuk in Dvarim, 3 pasukim, your brothers had full days, full lives, and experienced goodness. But you are young. You have not had full days. You have not had a full life, and you have never experienced goodness. Bow to the idol, and I will do good things for you. Now we see the emperor is reluctant to kill this child. Right? This child is a very young child. This child is what we'll call an Eloi, right? Clearly is a very intelligent child. Maybe we can even fill in that he's a very beautiful child. There's something about this child where the emperor hesitates. He did not hesitate with the other 6. It's like the son quotes a pasuk, off with your head, right? Sent off to execution. Now there's going to be an entire dialogue between the child and the emperor, and the mother is going to come in at the very end. And what's interesting here is, okay, and again, the child says, it's written in our Torah, the Lord will reign forever, and then a pasuk from Tehillim. I didn't have room. It really would be better if I had the Hebrew, but it would have added 2 more pages to the source sheet. So the emperor said, see your brothers slain before you. I am casting my ring to the ground before the idol. Just lift it up. You don't have to bow to the idol, but everyone's around watching, and I can't really back down, but I don't really want to kill you. So let's play this little game. I'm going to throw my ring in front of the idol, and I'm just going to ask you to pick up the ring. You and I both know you're not bowing, but I'll still look good, right? And he says that. Lift it so everyone knows you heeded my voice. He said, it is a shame for you, emperor, if you fear people who are your equivalent. Will I not fear Melech Malchei HaMelachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu? He said to them, is there a God in the world? And then now we're getting into a philosophical discussion with this very young child. Again, very interesting. And he says to him, woe are you, emperor? Have you seen a world without a master? And then he gets into, does your God have a mouth? And the child says, well, your gods have a mouth but cannot speak. Our God, right, invented the world with his breath. Does your God have eyes? Does your God have ears? Does your God have a nose? Does your God have hands? Does your God have feet? And each time the child comes back with different psukim that basically he says, your gods, your idols have nothing. They're inanimate objects. My God is a master of the universe. My God has incredible power and reach and ability. He said to him, if these are all attributes in your God, why does he not rescue you from my hand like he rescued Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? Now here we go. Because now the Midrash is beginning to say, why are some people saved and other people aren't? It's a really good question. And the emperor asks it. And what does the child say? Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were upright, and Nebuchadnezzar was king worthy of having a miracle performed through him. But you are not worthy, and we have been condemned to death at the hand of heaven. So this is a child who accepts whatever, God, whatever decree there is, does not look around and question. And he also says, it's not just me, it's also you, right? You're just not worthy. If you do not execute us, there are many executioners for God, many wolves, lions, snakes, leopards, and scorpions. It's a little bit like, if it's your time, it's your time. That's what he's saying. If you don't execute me and I go out and it's my time, then I'll be hit by a car. Ultimately, the Holy One, blessed be He, is destined to exact retribution from you for our blood. Immediately, he issued a decree to execute him. Okay, so that's it. The conversation's over. It's a very long conversation, quite unusual. In Maccabees as well, the youngest child has a conversation with the emperor. His mother said to him, by the life, her soliloquy here is very beautiful and heartbreaking. By the life of your head, emperor, give me my son and I will hug him and kiss him. He gave him to her and she bared her breasts and nursed him with her milk. So again, we have the nurturing mother, the nourishing mother, the woman who, a little bit like Sarah, who has fountains of milk, right? She nurses everyone around in the Midrash. And so we're meant to recognize this is still a child who's nursing, right? She said to him, by the life of your head, emperor, execute me first and then execute him. This is I bring this at the end to contrast the Doeg. The Midrash actually puts the Doeg story right after this one, right? Like, I wanted to move us towards something a little more hopeful, a little more positive, the positive image. The Midrash doesn't give us that luxury. We're going to read this and we're going to be like, this is the mother, right? This is the mother who is with her child at this moment, does not flinch, begs a little for something, some sort of, kill me first so I don't have to see this and so on. And then we're going to follow it with the Doeg story. So the Midrash pulls us out of our oh, what a terrible but beautiful story. And then no. She said to him, by the life of your head, execute me. The emperor said to her, I will not heed you because it is written. Look what the emperor does. He's so wicked. An ox or a sheep, it and its offspring, you shall not slaughter on one day. I know your pasuk in Vayikra. You're not allowed to execute a mother and its child on the same day. So I'm going to execute the child and then the mother. That's your Torah, right? The emperor quotes scripture. She said to him, you absolute fool. Have you already fulfilled all the mitzvot and only this one remains? That's the mitzvah you're keeping? Again. Immediately he commanded to execute the son. His mother fell upon him and was hugging him and kissing him. Very, very heartbreaking. She said to him, my son, and I love this next piece, go to Avram and say to him, do not be overly impressed with yourself. You said I built an altar and sacrificed Isaac. My mother built 7 altars and sacrificed 7 sons on one day. Yours was an ordeal. Mine was an action. So what does she do at this terrible, terrible moment? She says, we always talk about the Akedah, but the Akedah ends happily. He doesn't do it. God stays his hand. So you know what, Avram? I beat you. I'm being asked for far more than you were ever asked for. So I know you might be impressed that you were willing to go that far for your God, but I'm actually going that far for my God. While she was hugging him and kissing him, he issued a decree against him. They executed him upon her. When he was executed, the sages calculated the age of that child, and it was discovered that he was 2 years, 6 months, and 6.5 hours. At that moment, all the nations of the world screamed out, Halavai, and said, what is this God of these people doing to them? I wish they screamed in protest that they are killed on his behalf. In their regard it is written, for we are killed all day long for you in Tehillim. Sometime later the woman went mad. She fell from the roof and died to realize she who bore 7 is miserable. And a divine voice was called out saying, Em habanim smecha. The divine spirit was crying out and saying, Al Eila ani bochia. So the contrast to the God that we started with is wait, why did I let that happen? Or they deserved it, or I need the mourning women, is a God that is now in this Midrash, Al Eila ani bochia. God's heart is broken. God is crying out over the painful reality of this mother of her children. And so that is the Al Eila ani bochia. It's the divine spirit crying out. Okay. The last Midrash I'm going to bring is a famous Midrash, but most people don't know the Eichah Rabbah version. They know the Rashi version. It's about Rachel. And so we'll end with Kol Barama, right? We'll end with Rachel crying over her children, because that, if I want to invoke or end with the image of a woman, it's the image of the mother Rachel crying over her children as they go into exile, and we hold on to that image, and it comforts us, this idea that she is up there in Shamayim and she is crying. And that's what we're about to see. And we're going to see both the woman, Miriam bat Tanchum, and Rachel are basically going to say, in Miriam bat Tanchum challenges, she says to Avram, you think you're such a big deal, you're not, right? What I'm being asked to do is far more painful and terrible and tragic than what you were asked to do. So you can take your Akedah, yes, the Akedah, but there are events in Jewish history that go far beyond anything of the Akedah. And here we're going to have Rachel giving Musar to God. Okay, it's amazing. The Ptichta here, Kaf Daled, what's called the Proem. There is a very long, it's 24 sections before Eichah Rabbah opens. It was also a literary device that some of the rabbis, I don't know if it's all of them, but a lot of them open with a proem, which is a preamble. And the Eichah Rabbah proem or Petichta is particularly long, The last one is really quite amazing, where God is destroying the temple and exiling, and it doesn't matter, first temple, second temple. By the way, the lines are blurred. What are we talking about? Is it first temple, second temple? It doesn't matter. We kind of pull them together as one ongoing tragedy. They're the same. We read the same Eichah, which is about Bayit Rishon, but we read it about Bayit Sheni. And there, everyone comes before God and tries to get God to stop the destruction. And so what you have are, you have Avram and Yitzchak and Yaakov, of course, and David and Yirmiyahu and Moshe Rabbeinu, and you have the Aleph Bet coming and Shemayim Ba'aretz coming. It's very, very long, and each one come and try to interfere or get God to invoke mercy, and God refuses. God rejects all of their attempts. The last one to come is Rachel. She's going to be the only one who succeeds. Okay, she's the succeed. So all of these male, characters, all of these male greats, the leaders, and even the qualities of the creation and the letters of the alphabet. There's no woman in the story. Rachel's the only woman, and she's the last one. V'od amar Moshe b'fnei Ribono shel olam. Katafta b'toratecha v'shor oseh oto v'epeno lo tishchat b'yom echad. Now, I recognize the irony. Moshe is now bringing the pasuk the emperor brought. Right? What are you doing? And v'halo kvar hargu banim v'imoteim kama v'kama v'ata shotek. So Moshe tries to shame God by quoting a pasuk in the Torah and saying, what are you doing? You don't allow us to slaughter a mother and its animal on the same day, and you're allowing the Romans or the Babylonians or whoever, fill in whatever you like, to do all this slaughter. What is this? But God doesn't, Tashotek, you're silent. God doesn't answer. Ribono shel olam, galoi lefanecha sheyakov avdacha ahaveni ahava yetera. She doesn't go to psukim. She basically says, you and I both know, God, that Yaakov, your servant, loved me excessively, unbelievably, an overwhelming love. And he worked for 7 years. When those 7 years ended, and it came time for me to marry my husband, my father conspired, he decided to take counsel and swap for my sister, to put my sister instead of me. So first of all, we're now in a story that's filling in all those blanks, like what was happening, what was Rachel thinking, what was Leah thinking, and it was really, really hard for me. Kinodali Heitzah, because I was told what the counsel was. And the first thing she did was she called her beloved, her fiance, her chatan, and she said, by the way, my dad's planning this, and let's have a sign, so it can't go through. So she lets Yaakov know. So nichamti, I just heard a great share by Mike Foyer, who's a colleague of mine at Pardes. And nichamti could be to comfort, or it can mean to regret. It's the same word. Right? It's interesting. One word having several really different meanings. V'savalti atavati. And I decided to tolerate my ta'ava, which my desire to be first, my desire, I sacrificed, right? I regretted and I decided to lisbo. V'richamti alachoti shelo tetzeh lecherpa. What does she say? I'm going to have compassion on my sister that she not be utterly humiliated. V'le'erev chalfu achoti leba'ali b'shvili. This is where it's going to get a little R-rated, people. And in the evening, I had my sister, right? I was actively part of this. Masarti la'achoti, they swapped my sister. And masarti la'achoti kol simanim shemasarti leba'ali. I gave her all the signs that I had given my husband. Kidei sheyeh savor shi Rachel. So far, so good, and this matches up with what Rashi says. The next part Rashi doesn't quote. V'lo od ela shenichnasti tachat hamita shaya shochev im achoti. As I said, this is really uncomfortable and very explicit. Yaakov goes in to be with his wife to consummate the marriage with Leah, and Rachel is under the bed and acting as if she's the one in the bed. Okay, we can put a curtain there now, but as I said, the Midrash isn't afraid of that description. They're like, there's no other way. There's no other way. He didn't, even if you can say their body types were more or less the same, there's sound, right? There's a voice.
Yaakov knows that from his own experience, right?
Hakol kol Yaakov, beautiful. So she's the kol. She's under the bed. It's shocking. It's unbelievable. And she does it, and now she's going to use this with God. V'gamla chesed ima, gamalti chesed. What directed me, God, was rachamim and chesed. Look how far human beings can go. Look what they can give up. Their own self-interest, their own direct needs, when it comes to wanting to spare someone they love or someone that they see they're suffering, and they're led with rachamim and chesed. V'lo kineti ba, when I wasn't jealous of her because all I could think about was sparing her. V'lo hotzitia l'charpa. Uma ani shani basar v'adam afar ve'efer lo kineti l'tzara shali. V'lo hotzitia l'busha v'lecharpa. V'ata melech chai v'kayam rachman. Mibnei ma kinita la'avoda zara she'en ba mamash v'igleta banai. V'nergu b'charev v'asu oivim bam kirtzonam. So she basically turns to God in the way that Hannah did, and she says, shame on you. You're God. What are you jealous of idols? I, a human being, afar ve'efer, who had every reason to be jealous, and this became my co-wife, and we know they're going to have a tempestuous relationship. It's not going to be simple, and it's not going to be easy. And she said, I was able to overcome very legitimate human emotions. I overcame them because of chesed and rachamim. What are you doing? You're God. How dare you fall prey to these base human emotions of jealousy? And you're allowing this slaughter to take place. Shame on you. And what happens? Miyad nitgalalu rachamav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu va'amar b'shvilech Rachel ani machzir Yisrael l'mkoman. So immediately God's compassion is aroused, right, and says, for you, Rachel, I will return Yisrael to their place. Ha'odichtiv ko amar Adonai kol barama nishma nihi b'chi tamurim Rachel mivakal banea me'ena lihinachem al banea ki einenu. And then ko amar Adonai mini kolech mibechi ve'enayach midima ki yesh schar lepulatech ne'um Adonai. And so v'yesh tikva ba'acharitech ne'um Adonai v'shavu vanim legvulam. I can think of no other better way to end this shir. It was a hard shir. Thank you for staying with me. I find that these sources both allow me to have very strong emotions, questions, feelings around this time, the thoughts about responsibility and not only victimhood, the thoughts of the cycle of history that repeats itself, and yet ending with this very beautiful, very comforting pasuk that Rachel's lamentation and bitter weeping will ultimately end in the Geula and Shavu Vanim L'Geulam, and we are and we did, and may God protect us and keep us and stay with us through this period, and may we continue to stay in our land. Shavu Vanim L'Geulam. Thank you very much.
I was thinking backwards.
Yeah.
Once Eichah has described Jews of particular of Israel as the rebelling woman, the Tzmeah, or whatever, that then the stories then have to be about a female